An acquaintanceship. There were two restaurants in the Hotel Metropole. The Boyarsky, that fabled retreat on the second floor that we have already visited, and the grand dining room off the lobby known officially as the Metropole, but referred to affectionately by the Count as the Piazza. Admittedly, the Piazza could not challenge the elegance of the Boyarsky's decor, the sophistication of its service, or the subtlety of its cuisine. But the Piazza did not aspire to elegance, service, or subtlety. With 80 tables scattered around a marble fountain and a menu offering everything from cabbage, pierogi, to cutlets of veal, the Piazza was meant to be an extension of the city, of its gardens, markets, and thoroughfares. It was a place where Russians cut from every cloth could come to linger over coffee, happen upon friends, stumble into arguments, or drift into dalliances, and where the lone diner seated under the great glass ceiling could indulge himself in admiration, indignation, suspicion, and laughter without getting up from his chair. And the waiters? Like those of a Parisian cafe, the Piazza's waiters could best be complimented as efficient. Accustomed to navigating crowds, they could easily seat your party of 8 at a table for 4. Having noted your preferences over the sound of the orchestra, within minutes they would return with the various drinks balanced on a tray and dispense them round the table in rapid succession without misplacing a glass. If, with your menu in hand, you hesitated for even a second to place your order, they would lean over your shoulder and poke at a specialty of the house. And when the last morsel of dessert had been savoured, they would whisk away your plate, present your check, and make your change in under a minute. In other words, the waiters of the Piazza knew their trade to the crumb, the spoon, and the kopeck. At least, that was how things were before the war. Today, the dining room was nearly empty, and the Count was being served by someone who appeared not only new to the Piazza, but new to the art of waiting. Tall and thin, with a narrow head and superior demeanour, he looked rather like a bishop that had been plucked from a chessboard. When the Count took his seat with a newspaper in hand, the international symbol of dining alone, the chap didn't bother to clear the second setting. When the Count closed his menu and placed it beside his plate, the international symbol of readiness to order, the chap needed to be beckoned with a wave of the hand. And when the Count ordered the okroska and fillet of sole, the chap asked if he might like a glass of sauterne. A perfect suggestion, no doubt, if only the Count had ordered foie gras. "Perhaps a bottle of the Chateau de Baudelaire," the Count corrected politely. "Of course," the bishop replied, with an ecclesiastical smile. Granted, a bottle of Baudelaire was something of an extravagance for a solitary lunch, but after spending another morning with the indefatigable Michel de Montaigne, the Count felt that his morale could use the boost. For several days, in fact, he had been fending off a state of restlessness. On his regular descent to the lobby, he caught himself counting the steps. As he browsed the headlines in his favourite chair, he found he was lifting his hands to twirl the tips of moustaches that were no longer there. He found he was walking through the door of the Piazza at 12:01 for lunch. And at 1:35, when he climbed the 110 steps to his room, he was already calculating the minutes until he could come back downstairs for a drink. If he continued along this course, it would not take long for the ceiling to edge downward, the walls to edge inward, and the floor to edge upward, until the entire hotel had been collapsed into the size of a biscuit tin. As the Count waited for his wine, he gazed around the restaurant, but his fellow diners offered no relief. Across the way was a table occupied by 2 stragglers from the diplomatic corps, who picked at their food while they awaited an era of diplomacy. Over there in the corner was a spectacled denizen of the second floor with 4 enormous documents spread across his table, comparing them word for word. No one appeared particularly gay, and no one paid the Count any mind. That is, except for the young girl with the penchant for yellow who appeared to be spying on him from her table behind the fountain. According to Vasily, this 9-year-old with straight blonde hair was the daughter of a widowed Ukrainian bureaucrat. As usual, she was sitting with her governess. When she realized the Count was looking her way, she disappeared behind her menu. "Your soup," said the bishop. "Ah, thank you, my good man. It looks delicious. But don't forget the wine." "Of course." Turning his attention to his okroshka, the Count could tell at a glance that it was a commendable execution, a bowl of soup that any Russian in the room might have been served by his grandmother. Closing his eyes in order to give the first spoonful its due consideration, the Count noted a suitably chilled temperature, a tad too much salt, a tad too little kvass, but a perfect expression of dill, that harbinger of summer which brings to mind the songs of crickets and the setting of one's soul at ease. But when the Count opened his eyes, he nearly dropped his spoon. For standing at the edge of his table was the young girl with the penchant for yellow, studying him with that unapologetic interest peculiar to children and dogs. Adding to the shock of her sudden appearance was the fact that her dress today was in the shade of a lemon. "Where did they go?" she asked, without a word of introduction. "I beg your pardon? Where did who go?" She tilted her head to take a closer look at his face. "Why? Your moustaches." The Count had not much cause to interact with children, but he had been raised well enough to know that a child should not idly approach a stranger, should not interrupt him in the middle of a meal, and certainly should not ask him questions about his personal appearance. Was the minding of one's own business no longer a subject taught in schools? "Like swallows," the Count answered. "They travelled elsewhere for the summer." Then he fluttered a hand from the table into the air in order to both mimic the flight of the swallows and suggest how a child might follow suit. She nodded to express her satisfaction with his response. "I too will be travelling elsewhere for part of the summer." The Count inclined his head to indicate his congratulations. "To the Black Sea," she added. Then she pulled back the empty chair and sat. "Would you like to join me?" he asked. By way of response, she wiggled back and forth to make herself comfortable, then rested her elbows on the table. Around her neck hung a small pendant on a golden chain, some lucky charm or locket. The Count looked toward the young lady's governess with the hopes of catching her attention, but she had obviously learned from experience to keep her nose in her book. The girl gave another canine tilt to her head. "Is it true that you are a count?" "'Tis true." Her eyes widened. "Have you ever known a princess?" "I have known many princesses." Her eyes widened further, then narrowed.